Hello everyone, welcome to this live series that is brought to you by CAT by LPT. Guys, we are running this series wherein we pick up these 200 questions that comes from across the three sections. So we are doing it for VARC, we are doing it for DILR, and we are also doing it for Quant. Now remember one thing, for those of you who have been following these sessions for quite some time now, I hope that you already know what do we do in these sessions. But for those of you who are new into these sessions, please understand that we take up these questions which are at the same difficulty level as what you see in CAT. So we are doing it for RCs also as far as VARC is concerned, and we are doing it for VA also. So what I'm going to do today is we are going to solve one RC with 5 questions, plus we will also be solving 4 questions of VA, and that will enable you to understand so how these questions are actually solved and what are the things that you should keep in mind while answering those questions. So what I want you people to do is, for those of you who have been watching me since some time now, just understand one thing, that you have to read the passage, and of course once you read the passage, then we talk about how do you solve the questions and what are the grounds on the basis of which we eliminate the options. Guys, understand one thing, when you talk about RCs or when you talk about VA, of course, it is a test of your reading skills and it is also a test of your comprehension skills. Along with those two skills, you also have to pay attention that when you're solving a particular question, you should also be good at eliminating the choices. So whether you are doing it for RC or you are doing it for VA, just make sure that the grounds of elimination, because that is something that defines your accuracy in the VARC section. Now there are many people who have told me that despite practicing hard, we are not able to touch a decent score or a percentile in VARC. What I tell those students is that just make it sure that you are practicing every single day. You analyze your mistakes as to why you have chosen a certain option and why you have eliminated other options. This analysis is going to help you to decide on the course of action, which will help you to minimize your mistakes and to maximize your score. So without wasting any more time, let us get started with the RC passage for today. Just remember one thing, you read this passage as we go about reading the passages and solving the questions. From your side, it should be clear that you should be having an answer in your mind. So when you solve the questions and you have these 4 options, just make sure that you're eliminating the choices, and then we discuss the passage. So we'll be discussing the main idea of the passage. We will also be discussing what are the subsidiary ideas that has been presented to you in the passage, and then we will talk about how do you go about eliminating the options before you come to the right answer in an RC. Also, I have kept telling this in almost all of my live streams that when you talk about the VARC section, it is all about finding a decent balance between your RC questions and your VA questions. So don't commit a mistake wherein you are neglecting VA questions completely, because it has got its share of easy questions, it has got its share of moderate questions, and it has also got a share of difficult questions. So difficult questions can be skipped. Of course, we are not supposed to solve all the 24 questions, but yes, the analysis in terms of which questions are to be done and which questions have to be avoided can best be done when you take your sectional test and your mock test. So I think we are good to go. Let us get started with the passage. So here I have a passage for you. Start reading in the designated time. Understand those ideas, process those ideas, comprehend them, and then we will talk about how do you answer the question. So here is the slide for you. Please start solving. Start reading the passage, guys, for those of you who are with me. Start reading the passage. Try to read and comprehend the ideas before we go to the next slide. For those of you who are solving with me, just let me know when to run the next slide. Alright guys, so I hope you have done reading the first two paragraphs. Let's go to the next. Yeah, here is the next one. Alright guys, so I believe you have read the passage and you would have comprehended according to your competency. Now the key point is that how do we read the passage and how do we look at what information is crucial for us to answer the questions and which information is something that you can just read it once and let it go. Now I tell students that when you're talking about CAT RCs, remember one thing, most of these RCs are centered around the main idea. So when you solve CAT RCs, just remember one thing, you should be in a position that when you read the passage, you are able to understand what exactly is the main idea that is emphasized by the author, and simultaneously you are also paying attention to the subordinate ideas which have been given over here, which actually support the main argument or the main idea, right? So let us get started with the passage. Let us read it together and try to understand what the passage is all about and what is the information that has been given to us. Once we comprehend the passage, then we will go to the questions, look at the options, eliminate those choices, and then talk about arriving at a correct answer. So let us get started. Fine. So it says more and more companies, government agencies, educational institutions, and philanthropic organizations are today in the grip of a new phenomena, right? So we are talking about these companies, agencies, institutions, and organizations today in the grip of a new phenomena. What exactly is that phenomena? It says metric fixation. So we are talking about a new phenomena in these companies, organization, and institution. It says metric fixation is what we are discussing here. It says the key components of metric fixation are the belief that it is possible. So again, we are defining metric fixation, that it is possible. Fine, it says the key components of metric fixation are the belief that it is possible and desirable to replace professional judgment acquired through personal experience and talent with numerical indicators of comparative performance. So you can have a sort of professional judgment by making use of numerical indicators of comparative performance based upon standardized data, which is known as metrics, and that the best way to motivate people within these organizations. So we have talked about these companies, agencies, institutions, and organizations is by attaching rewards and penalties to their measured performance. So when you talk about metric fixation, this has been defined in the first paragraph. All right, so what exactly is metric fixation? And it says that we are able to achieve a certain result by attaching rewards and penalties to their measured performance. So this is how you understand the first paragraph. Let's go to the next paragraph now. It says the rewards can be monetary in the form of pay for performance or reputational. So the rewards can take any form. It can be in the sense of monetary reward, or it can be in the sense of reputational. It says in the form of college rankings, hospital ratings, surgical report cards, and so on. So it could be monetary, it could be reputational. But the most dramatic negative effect, the author is talking about the negative effect of metric fixation. What does he say? But the most dramatic negative effect of metric fixation is its propensity to incentivize gaming. So here is some bulk of phrases coming here which is important to understand. So it says, is its propensity. Propensity is the inclination to do something. Propensity to incentivize gaming. Let us understand what does the author mean. He says that is encouraging professionals to maximize the metrics in ways that are at odds with the larger purpose of the organization. So incentivize gaming is something which is negative according to the author, because he says that it encourages professionals to maximize the metrics that is at odds with the larger purpose of the organization. If the rate of major crime, so here comes an example. The example has been quoted over here, and students, please understand one thing. Whenever you are reading a passage and you come across an example, that example has to be understood in the right way, because there is very much a possibility that you may have a question which talks about what are the learnings out of that example. So whenever you read a particular example or you see a particular example being used, make sure you understand what point is being emphasized by the author by quoting that example. So let us read it further. It says, if the rate of major crimes in a district becomes the metric according to which police officers are promoted, then some officers will respond. It is saying what? Some officers will respond by simply not recording crimes. Now, this is again something which is counterproductive. So, if it is a metric based evaluation, right? So, some of them officers will do what? They will simply not record the crime, or downgrading them for major offenses to misdemeanors. Okay, so this is something which should not be done in the first place, but because you have got metric fixation in place, you have certain metrics that needs to be fulfilled. This is what some officers will end up doing. Now, or take the case of surgeons. Now, the author is using one more example here. So he talked about police officers. Let's talk about surgeons. What does it say? When the metrics of success and failure are made public. So this is reputational. It says affecting their reputation and income, some surgeons will improve their metric scores by refusing to operate on patients with more complex problems. Again, this is again an outcome which is negative on the side of the metric fixation. So some surgeons would not be taking up cases which are far more complex problems, whose surgical outcomes are more likely to be negative, who suffers the patients who don't get operated upon. So the author has used these two examples here to emphasize the fact that metric fixation can be misused as a parameter to judge the reputation or the performance. Let's read further. Now, when reward is tied to measured performance, metric fixation invites just this sort of gaming. So the kind of incentivizing the gaming that we were referring to has been explained in the last paragraph by quoting the example of police officer and surgeon. Now it says what? It invites just this sort of gaming, which is incentivized gaming, but metric fixation also leads to a variety of more subtle, unintended negative consequences. So, the author talked about a negative consequence of metric fixation. Now, he's elaborating more on that. So, what does it say? These include goal displacement, which comes in many varieties, which is that it says when performance is judged by a few measures and the stakes are high, keeping one's job, getting a pay rise, or raising the stock price at the same time that stock options are vested, people focus on satisfying those measures. So if you have these metrics, if you have these measures, so you focus more on those measures, often at the expense of other more important organizational goals. So you focus on those metrics and you overlook more important measures, organizational goals that are not measured. The best known example is teaching to the test, a widespread phenomena that has distorted primary and secondary education. So this is again one more example that is quoted by the author, and he says you have teaching to the test, which is a widespread phenomena that has distorted primary and secondary education in the United States since the adoption of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. So again, the author has added one more negative consequence of metric fixation. Let us read further. Short-termism. Again, this is one thing which is important mention here. It says short-termism is another negative. So the list of negative does not stop here. So you have the author mentioning you one more example. It says measured performance encourages what the US sociologist Robert K. Metron in 1936 called the imperious immediacy of interest. Let us understand what it means. It says where the actor's paramount concern with the foreseen immediate consequences excludes consideration of further or other consequences. In short, so again he has given a shorter version here. He says, in short, advancing short-term goals at the expense of long-range consideration. So when you talk about institutions, organizations and companies, what happens is short-termism is another fallout of metric fixation. So it says advancing short-term goals at the expense of long-range considerations. This problem is endemic to publicly traded corporations that sacrifice long-term research and the development of their staff to the perceived imperatives of the quarterly report. So for them, the quarterly report is more important than the performance of the employees or some other way of measuring their performance. Let's read further. This is the last paragraph now. It says, to the debit side of the ledger must also be added. So again, one more negative consequence of metric fixation. It says he added the transactional cost of metrics. So he's talking about the costing of metrics, the expenditure of employee time by those tasked with compiling and processing the metrics in the first place, not to mention the time required to actually read them. So again, the author finishes by saying that there is one more negative to the metric fixation process, and he has said the transactional cost of metrics, the expenditure of employee time by those tasked with compiling and processing. So it is compiling and processing those metrics, plus not to mention the time required to actually read and evaluate those metric systems. So this is how the author is ending the passage, and when we read the passage, we have understood what were the ideas that were being talked about, what was the information that was given, what was the example given, so that now we are ready to answer the questions on the basis of the way we have understood the passage and the way we have comprehended it. Let's go to the first question. I'll give you some time to answer those questions, and then we go about answering and eliminating the choices. The first question says, what main point does the author want to convey through the examples of the police officer and the surgeon? Try answering this question. 1 minute before we start discussing. All right, let us try to answer this question. Let's go back to the passage where it was mentioned. Right, so this is the reference point for us to answer the question. The question is asking you what is the main point the author wants to emphasize with respect to the examples of the police officer and the surgeon. So this is where we were reading it. So when you look at this context that has been given to you, I'm sure you would have read it and you understand why the author has understood the, or rather mentioned the example of police officer and surgeon. This was more about misuse. Okay, so we were actually talking about with reference to the police officer and the surgeon to say that the metric fixation process can be misused if the stakes are high. So whether it is police officers by not recording the crimes and downgrading them from major offences to misdemeanors, or it is the example of a surgeon who will improve their metric scores by refusing to operate on patient with more complex problems. So this was the misuse that can be done with respect to the metric fixation. Let us have a look at the options here and evaluate these choices. First says, some professionals are likely to be significantly influenced by the design of performance measurement system. Now see, if you look at the way the author has written this entire passage, the tone of the author is negative. So when the tone of the passage is negative, understand one thing, any answer that has a positive undertone is automatically eliminated. So it says what? Significantly influenced. So again, this is not the major point that the author wanted to emphasize. He wanted to emphasize that the police officer and the surgeon can misuse the metric fixation that is there as a policy. So first will be cancelled out because it has a slightly positive undertone associated with it. Let's read second. It says metrics linked rewards may encourage unethical behavior among some professionals. So now this comes very close to the misuse that we were talking about. So the example was given with respect to the police officer and surgeon was to show that if you have metric fixation process in a particular organization or an institution, there might be a misuse associated with it. So it says unethical behavior, very close to what we were looking for, but let us also evaluate the other two options. If we find something better than this, then we'll go for that option. If not, we will stick with option B. Let's look at what C has to say. It says the actions of police officers and surgeons have a significant impact on society. Well, the light of the passage was not on the positive side of metric fixation, it was on the negative side. So again, this would be cancelled out for the same reason, because the author is not somebody who supports the metric fixation process in organizations and companies, can be eliminated. And it says critical public roles should not be evaluated on metric based performance measures. So it does talk about critical public roles, but when he mentioned those examples, he did not mean to say that should not be evaluated. He actually said that the police officer and the surgeon may misuse the metric fixation methodology, and they will cater it to their own benefit or their own stake. So if you look at these options, the best answer that you can choose as an answer to this question is option number 2. Guys, if you learn how do you eliminate the choices, what are the grounds of elimination, I'm sure you understand that that helps you to increase your accuracy level. So just make sure when you're solving an RC passage, your grounds of elimination of other options has to be very clear. Let's go to the second question now. It says, which of the following is not a consequence of metric fixation phenomena mentioned in the passage? So look at the 4 options and try to come up with an answer. It is asking you not a consequence of metric fixation. Alright, let us try to answer this question. I'm sure for those of you who are solving this passage, you would have got some answer by now. Let's evaluate these options. It says improving cooperation among employees leading to increased organizational effectiveness in the long run. Now, for those of you who have read the passage completely and have understood the ideas that is mentioned by the author here, I'm sure you understand the fact that the author isn't the support of metric fixation. So, he has talked about various negative consequences of metric fixation. So, it says what is not a consequence. Okay, so if you look at this first option, it is on a positive side of metric fixation, and we are looking for not a consequence. So this is absolutely not a consequence of metric fixation as understood from the passage. So if you read the first option itself, I think you would have got your answer. But if you are not sure, let's also look at the other options. Let us keep it aside. Second one says short-term orientation induced by frequent measurement of performance. So when we were reading the passage, we talked about short-term goal evaluation. So the author said that when you talk about metric fixation as a process, you might overlook your organizational long-term goals as opposed to their short-term goals. So this was emphasized by the author. This will not be the answer because it says is not a consequence. And short-termism, of course, if you go back to the passage here, so look at this reference point. This entire thing was talking about short-termism is another negative consequence of metric fixation. So this is definitely a consequence, cannot be our answer. Now, third one says finding a way to show better results without actually improving performance. The author did talk about this, that when you have this metric fixation in process, some people would overlook the actual long-term goals as opposed to the short-term goals. And it also says finding a way to show better results without actually improving performance. So the example of police officer and the example of the surgeon was a testimony to that. So again, this will be cancelled out because this is a consequence of metric fixation. Fourth says deviating from organizationally important objectives to measurably yet important objectives. Even this has been mentioned in the passage because the author says that you may compromise the company's or the organization's long-term goals as opposed to their short-term goals. So even this will not be the answer choice. The answer would be option number 1. Let's go to the third question now. Of the following, which would have added the least depth to the author's argument? So he's asking you least depth to the author's argument. We have understood the argument. Just evaluate these options. Sorry. Okay, let us evaluate these options and see to it if we can answer this question. So it says of the following, which would have added least depth to the author's argument? The author's argument was that metric fixation as a performance evaluation process has a lot more negative consequences as compared to the positive ones. In fact, he has not talked about any positive consequence of metric fixation. So let us evaluate these options. First one says an analysis of the reasons why metric fixation is becoming popular despite its future. All right, so we are talking about the standardized test scores. One second, guys. Yeah, so it talks about which would have added least depth to the author's argument. So it says analysis of the reasons why metric fixation is becoming popular despite its drawbacks. Well, we will evaluate it. Let's look at the other options as well. Second one says more real life illustrations of the consequences of employees and professionals gaming metrics based performance measurement system. Third says a comparative case study of metrics and non-metrics based evaluation and the impact on main goals of an organization. So study of metrics and non-metrics. Fourth says assessment of pros and cons of professional judgment. Now, when you look at this first option, third option and fourth option, it does talk about the plus and the minus of metric fixation. On the other hand, if you look at option number 2, it only talks about more real life illustration of the consequences of employees professionals gaming metric based performance measure system. The author is not the supporter of metric fixation problem and metric fixation process, and he says that there are various negative outcomes which is related to the metric fixation process. So this is something which is adding least step, because in the other options you at least have a mention of plus and minus. So here you have plus and minus, here you have plus and minus, here you have plus and minus. But if you look at the second one, this is simply about more real life examples of metric fixation consequences, and this does not talk about the cons of it. So because that was the main focus of the author in writing this passage, so this would have added least depth to the argument of the author, and hence second becomes the correct answer. Guys, it's just that you understand the question properly. So it is asking you least depth, so the rest of the options would still have some sort of conclusion, would have some sort of results with respect to the author's argument. Second one is purely based on real life illustrations of the consequences of employees and professionals gaming metrics based performance style systems, and this is not talking about the flip side of the metric system. So this would have the least depth to the author's argument, and that is why it becomes our answer choice. Let's look at the fourth question. It says all of the following can be possible feature of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 except. Talking about possible feature of No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. Just go through the options and see to this. Okay, so it talks about No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, and we are supposed to answer the question which is all of the following can be a possible feature of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 except. So we are looking for an except answer. Let's evaluate these choices. First one says a standardized test scores can be critical in determining a student's educational future. Now this is of course a feature of No Child Left Behind, so this will not be the answer choice. Let's evaluate second. It says the focus is more on test taking skills than on higher order thinking and problem solving. Now this is also the negative fallout of metric fixation. Third one says school funding and sanctions are tied to yearly improvement shown on tests. Again, this is something which is based on the metric fixation. The answer should be fourth one. It says assessment is dependent on teacher's subjective evaluation. Okay, so when we talked about No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, we were saying that if the same metrics are applied to the school system, this is what the consequences would be. So first, second and third is the negative fallout of metric fixation. Whereas when you talk about fourth, it says assessment is dependent on the teacher's subjective evaluation, where you don't pay special emphasis to the metric fixation. So this is the answer to the except one and forms a correct answer. I hope you understand how we have related metric fixation with No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. So just for those of you who are slightly confused, just go back to the passage, reread that part. If I were to give you the reference, yeah, so here is where you find the reference, and it talks about it has distorted primary and secondary education in the United States is the adoption of No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. So the author again has emphasized the negative consequences of metric fixation with respect to the example that he has quoted here. So let's go to the next question now. We are done with four. Last question. What is the main idea that the author is trying to highlight in the passage? So this is a main idea question. Just have a look at the options and try to come up with an answer. What is the main idea that the author is trying to highlight in the passage? Sorry. Okay, let us evaluate these options because I'm sure you have read the passage in a depth, and you have understood the main ideas, the key ideas. Let's just evaluate in terms of the options. First one says all kinds of organization are now relying on metrics to measure performance and to give rewards and punishment. Well, this is not the main idea. The author was of the view that metric fixation as a process is something which has lot more negative consequences as opposed to the positive one. He has not talked about any positive consequence of metric fixation, in fact. So it is all about the negative consequences. This cannot be our answer choice. Let's go to the second one. It says long-term organizational goals should not be ignored for short-term measures of organizational success. This is something that is discussed in the passage, but this is not the main idea. The main idea was that metric fixation as a process has got lots of negative consequences attached with it. So this will be cancelled out. Third says performance measurement needs to be precise and cost effective to be useful for evaluating organizational performance. The author does not support metric fixation as a performance evaluation process. So even this will be cancelled out. Fourth one says evaluating performance by using measurably performance metrics may misguide organizational goal achievement. This is what the author has emphasized, that you might have negative consequences of metric fixation, and in trying to replicate that system into an organization, you might misguide organizational goal achievement, and this becomes the main idea of the author in the entire passage. So this is how you go about answering the questions, eliminating the option on the basis of logic step by step, and this is the way you should be looking in terms of solving an RC. Now let us practice some VA questions, because I believe VA questions are also a game changer. So we have done with one RC passage with 5 questions. Let us do some VA questions now to have a better understanding how these VA questions are handled. So let's look at the next question. This is a paragraph summary question. Start doing this and please come up with an answer, and then we discuss what should be the right summary. Okay, I hope you have read the paragraph and you might have some answers in your mind with respect to what forms an adequate summary. Let's read the paragraph, try to understand and comprehend the key idea, and then look at the options as to which one forms as a right summary. So it says the early optimism about sports deterrent effects on delinquency was premature, as researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. So we are talking about the sports deterrent effects on delinquency. Delinquency is basically the crime committed by the minors. So it says the researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance, as the initial studies were based upon cross-sectional data and the effects captured were short-term. Okay, we are talking about the negative side of it. So there was this research being done with respect to sports deterrent effects on delinquency, which is the crime committed by the minors. It says was premature, as the researchers failed to find any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. As the initial studies were based upon cross-sectional data and the effects captured were short-term, it was problematic to test and verify the temporal sequencing of events suggested by deterrence theory. So you could not come to a final conclusion about that. All right. It says what? It was problematic to test and to verify the temporal sequencing of events. The correlation between sports and delinquency could not be disentangled from class and cultural variables known. Choosing individuals to play sports in the first place was problematic, which became more acute in the subsequent decades as researchers began to document just how closely sports participation was linked to social class indicators. So this is what the paragraph has to offer. So we were talking about the relationship between sports deterrent effects and delinquency. The researchers could not establish, so they failed to find any consistent relationship between the two. And the problem was that it was problematic to test and verify the temporal sequencing of events suggested and so on. Let us go to the options and try to understand if we can find these information in a certain option. It says sports participation is linked to class and cultural variables such as education, income and social capital. The first one misses out on the most important detail. It gives you only what was mentioned at the end of the paragraph. This is completely losing out on the important point, so this cannot be your answer, so can be cancelled. B says contradicting the previous optimism. Okay, latter researchers, look at this. Where is this latter researchers coming from? Because we have just talked about researchers here. We have not talked about in the sense of the former or the latter. It says latter researchers have proved that there is no consistent relationship. Now, see, we were saying that they could not come to a sort of conclusion, okay? And this said that there is no consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance. This is absolutely missing on point. So it says what? Failed to find any consistent relationship, and these were problematic to test and to verify. Whereas this says failed to have any consistent relationship between sports participation and deviance, can be cancelled out. Third says statistical and empirical weakness stand in the way of inferring any relationship between sports participation and deviance. This matches up to the theory that they failed to find any consistent relationship here because the initial studies were cross-sectional and the effects captured were short term. It was problematic to test and verify. So this is very close in saying statistical and empirical weakness, right? Stand in the way of inferring any relationship between sports participation and deviance. Something very similar to what we understood from the passage. First says there is a direct relationship. Again, this is contradictory. It says what? There is a direct relationship between sports participation and delinquency, but it needs more empirical evidence. There was no relationship that could be expressed. So, failed to find any consistent relationship, and that is only supported in option number 3. So, 3 becomes the answer and fourth one is cancelled out. Okay, let's go to the next question now. We have a question of odd one out. So, here is a question of odd one out. Try solving it and then we will go about solving it together and getting to the right answer. You have to figure out which statement is the odd one out here. Okay, guys, let us try and understand how do we go about solving the odd one out question. Now, see, guys, the directions to the questions are a clue. So, if you read the directions that is given, it says 5 sentences related to a topic are given below. So, understand one thing very clearly, that all of these 5 sentences will be related to the same topic. All right. But then 4 of them can be put together to form a meaningful and coherent short paragraph. Identify the odd one out. So basically, when you talk about odd one out question, it's a kind of question that is very similar, that follows the very similar approach to what we do with parajumble questions. So I tell students that instead of just reading the sentences and on the surface level and trying to figure out what exactly is the right answer, it is better to form the sequence of sentences, and then the sentence that does not fit into that particular sequence or the format is the answer that we are looking for. So let us get started by figuring out what sentence comes first, what comes next, and then we go about identifying the one which is the odd one out. Let's read out these sentences. It says, displacement in Bengal is thus not very significant in view of its magnitude. So, okay, it talks about displacement in Bengal. Second says, a factor of displacement in Bengal is the shifting course of the Gangas leading to the erosion of river banks. So, it talks about shifting course of Gangas leading to the erosion of river banks. Third one says, the nature of displacement in Bengal makes it an interesting case study. All right. Fourth says, since displacement due to erosion is well spared over a long period of time, it remains invisible. And fifth says, rapid displacement would have helped sensitize the public to its human cost. So when you look at these all 5 sentences, they talk about the fact of displacement in Bengal. Now, if you compare all of these 5 choices, I'm sure you understand the fact that we'll start with 3 because it introduces the idea to be discussed. So, it says the nature of displacement in Bengal makes it an interesting case study. So, third comes first. Then you have a factor of displacement in Bengal. So you talked about the case study. Then you are talking about the factor of displacement in Bengal is that shifting course of Gangas leading to erosion of river banks. So 2 comes here. It talks about erosion of river banks. All right, this has been mentioned here. Then you say, since displacement due to erosion. Okay, so you talked about erosion of river banks. Then you would have fourth statement coming up, since displacement due to erosion is well spread over a long period of time, it remains invisible. So it says it remains invisible. Then you have a result. So this is the cause, here is the effect. It says displacement in Bengal is thus not very significant in view of its magnitude because it remains invisible. So you have 1 coming up here. On the other hand, if you look at 5, it says rapid displacement would have sensitized, helped sensitize the public to its human cost. This is something which is talking about sensitizing the public, which does not match to the rest of the discussion in the paragraph. So your odd one out is sentence number 5. So 3, 2, 4, 1 forms a sequence of the ideas being discussed here. Fifth one talks about sensitizing the public to its human cost, and this is an idea which is completely unrelated to the rest of the 4 statements. So that fifth one becomes our odd one out. Let's go to the next question now. Now this is a question of parajumble. Try solving this question. Let me know if you have any answers to this question. You have to arrange these sentences into the correct sequence. Okay, let us evaluate this question and try to understand what is the sequence of the sentences that we should be following. So, A says they include along with speech, gestures, facial and bodily expressions. Now, this is a sentence that is somewhere in the middle of the discussion. B says even after language itself has evolved in all complexity, gestures are still used consciously and unconsciously as an enhancement to the spoken language. So we talk about gestures being used, still being used consciously and unconsciously as an enhancement to the spoken language. He says there is enough evidence to believe that hand gestures, bodily and facial expressions preceded speech in the evolution of communication system. So we are now mentioning hand gestures, bodily and facial expressions preceded speech. He says when we hear the word communication, a majority of us think only of verbal interaction. Okay, so again, E says human communication comes in various modes. Now, once you have read the 5 sentences, I'm sure you would have understood that out of these sentences, the one that is starting on an idea or introducing an idea is sentence number D. So D says when we hear the word communication, a majority of us think only of verbal interaction. It is giving you a point to start a discussion. Then it says human communication comes in various modes. So you have D and E coming up here. So you introduced communication in the 4th sentence, the D sentence. Then you talk about the modes of human communication. Now, because you're talking about modes of human communication, you have the next sentence, which is A. It says they include, along with speech, gestures, facial and bodily expressions. So we have talked about gestures, facial and bodily expressions. Then you have C coming up here, which is there is enough evidence to believe that hand gestures, bodily and facial expressions preceded speech in the evolution of communication system. So D comes next, and then you will wind up by saying even after language itself has evolved in all complexity, gestures are still used consciously and unconsciously as an enhancement to the spoken language. So you have D, E, A, C, B as the sequence. Now this was not a very difficult question, something which was of a moderate range. But I want to emphasize one thing, students, that when you talk about the VS section in the last 3 years, it has not been the case that there have been exceedingly difficult questions of VA. So out of these 8 questions, you definitely can do 4 questions, but then the main point comes down to which are the 4 questions that are definitely in the range of doable questions and manageable questions. And if you are somebody who can scan and narrow down on which options or which questions are supposed to be answered, I think you would have an edge over those individuals who are only depending on RCs with respect to maximizing their score. So this one has an answer which is D, E, A, C, B as the sequence. Let's go to the last question now. Yeah, so this is a question of sentence placement. I'm sure you understand how we are supposed to deal it. So you have a question here, a sentence here. You have to decide which blank it fits into. Try coming up with an answer if you have any. Let me know if you have any answers. Alright, so let us try and understand how do we go about solving a sentence placement question, guys. Now, sentence placement questions are a questions that you can do safely with elimination. So I tell students that for those of you who know how these questions are solved and you have got a better accuracy, you would not be facing any more issues here. But for those of you who are struggling with the accuracy, I tell students and advise them that it's better to figure out where it will not fit, right? So figure out where it cannot go into, because that will ultimately lead you to the blank where it can actually fit in. So let's try and read this paragraph and the sentence and try to make sense of where it cannot actually fit in. So let's read out the sentence. It says, appreciation as I use it here may begin with the thankfulness for what you have, but it goes beyond that to a broader understanding of how the world works and what is valuable in that. So this is the sentence that we are supposed to fit it into the blank in the passage. Let's read out the paragraph. It says, so you have a blank here and it says, to appreciate what you have. Now see, if you look at this blank one, I'm sure you understand the fact here that this cannot fit in, because this is something that is coming somewhere in the discussion that is going on. So if you look at this first line that is given to you here and you look at this context here, this is most likely not going to be where the sentence fits in. Let us read the paragraph still. It says, to appreciate what you have is to recognize the value of the people, things and world around you, as well as your attributes, and to treat all of these with the care and consideration they deserve. So you are defining what is appreciation. So if you look at this line here, it simply describes what is to appreciate. Okay, let's read further. In this sense, so here is one sense that is given to you, all right, and this is the description that we are talking about. Next line says what? In this sense, appreciation means not just being grateful for what you have. So not just being grateful for what you have or what you have been given, because gratitude does not necessarily imply an attitude of care and consideration. So the author is talking about one definition or interpretation of appreciation, that is, gratitude does not necessarily imply an attitude of care and consideration. Now this gels with the previous idea. Let's read further. Then you have a blank here. It says, appreciation can also lead us to a critical attitude in a way that gratitude does not, because we may recognize that the world and its inhabitants are not cared for as they should be. Then you have a blank here and it says, it is not easy to engage in this kind of appreciation. Now, it says in this kind of appreciation, which means that the appreciation that we are talking about has to come before, all right? So it cannot be somewhere over here. And it says, and not only because it asks us to think in these multiple registers, even when things are going well, you might not feel that you are appreciated all as much as you could or should. So I'm sure you just have understood the flow of the ideas that is going on over here. So of course it cannot go into 4 and 3 because it has crossed that threshold of discussion as to how you have put up the first statement. Now you also understand the fact that first cannot be the answer, because here you have a different version or the added version of what appreciation as a concept is. So first is cancelled out. So the best option that you can have here is second one, because it says what? Appreciation as I use it here may begin with thankfulness for what you have, but it goes beyond that broader understanding. And here also you talk about gratitude does not necessarily imply an attitude of care and consideration. So on the same idea you continue this one. So second one, so second one becomes your answer. So the answer would be option B. So guys, I often tell students that when you're solving a sentence placement question or a sentence insertion question, just figure out where it will not go. And whichever option that you decide, let's say you pick up second option or the third option or the fourth option, you will always have some clue which will give you some idea कि आपने जो ब्लैंक को चूज किया है वो वहां पे फिट हो सकता है या नहीं. सो ये जो लाइन थी यहाँ पे, which was gratitude does not necessarily imply an attitude of care and consideration, With the same idea, you have this statement coming up: appreciation as I use it here may begin with thankfulness, but it goes beyond that, a broader understanding. All right. So then the answer becomes option 2. Right, so this is where we come to the end of this session, guys. So I'm sure for those of you who are following me since the last 45 days, you understand what we do in these sessions. For those of you who are new, we are solving these 200 VARC most challenging questions for CAT 2025. It's just that if you want to improve on your VARC score, follow these sessions, solve the questions along with us, try to understand what are the parameters on the basis of which we eliminate the choices, what are the grounds, what is the logic, and I'm sure you're good to go. So it's just about the fact that CAT isn't very far now, so you just have got roughly 3 months now. September, October, November, you have your paper. Just make sure you practice a lot of questions in the last 3 months. You are clear with your basics and fundamentals. You have done the basics of RC, para-jumbles, para-summary, sentence insertion, odd one out questions, and now you are taking your sectional test, you're analyzing them, you are taking your mock test, you're analyzing them, and you're just figuring out what are the most strategic ways in which you can maximize your score. So if you have got any doubt with respect to your preparation, do let us know, and we would be happy to help. For today, this was the all the agenda that I had planned for you. So we solved one RC of CAT difficulty level. We solved some 4 questions of VA. Just go through the video once again. If you are somebody who is watching it from the middle, follow it from the beginning till the end. I'm sure you will find some insights that will help you in your preparation for the VARC section. Also remember, we go live every day at 6 p.m. Alright, so if you want to follow these sessions for other sections also, so VARC is done today, then you will have DILR, you will have CON. So follow these sessions. I'm sure it will help you to streamline your preparation and gain more confidence in terms of your VARC performance. So thank you so much. Have a good day and wish you all the best for your preparation. See you in the next live stream and be happy till that. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.